So 1 Peter 1. But as a means of introducing 1 Peter 1, I actually want to read to you a verse that might seem painful for many of you to hear right now. Painful because of the dissonance between the reality in this passage. John 10:7 says, "Therefore Jesus said again, Very truly I tell you, I am the gate for the sheep. All who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." As we enter into Advent, today I want to talk about hope. And I actually read John 10 this morning, and when I read that passage, I just thought, wow, having life to the full. I don't know many people who say they are experiencing that. Is it a cruel irony that there is not a fullness of life in a lot of believers' life? Now, before people say, well, Ben, how do you have fullness of life in a pandemic when everything's taken away? I go, wait. In 2019, 18, 17, and 16 in ministry, I still remember coming across Christians who denied that there was a fullness of life. I've had people tell me that joy is a myth. That people just tell me there's nothing to be hopeful for. And so I want to address the concept behind it of hope and how we can have hope and how hope brings out fullness of life and how there's multiple levels of hope, and we oftentimes get them confused and mixed up and conflated and forgotten. So with the promise of a full life and the idea of hope in the back of your mind, follow along with me as I read 1 Peter 1, 3 through 16. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. This inheritance is kept in heaven for you, who through faith are shielded by God's power until the coming of the salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. And all this you will greatly rejoice. Though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief and all its kinds of trials, these have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when in Christ Jesus is revealed. Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and are filled with an inexpressible and glorious joy. For you are receiving the end result of your faith, the salvation of your souls. Concerning this salvation, the prophets who spoke of the grace that has to come to you searched intently with the greatest care, trying to find out the time and circumstances to which the Spirit of Christ in them was pointing when he predicted the sufferings of the Messiah and the glories that would follow. It was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves but you when they spoke of the things that have now been told to you by those who have preached the gospel to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven. Even angels long to look into these things. Therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed at his coming. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy, because I am holy. There's a lot that can be done that will, hopefully in your personal readings you will dive into inside of that passage. But I want to pull back and think about hope, just hope in general. Oftentimes as a coach, I encounter it where I ask a kid, "Are you ready?" And they say, "I hope so." And that level of hope is kind of a vague feeling of possibility, no real certitude. Certainty, not certitude, where there's kind of maybe. And that kind of hoping it's weak, it's frail, it's vain, it's valueless. Then there's the hope that is kind of the intermediate level, where it's the hope that things will get better, that things aren't as bad as they could be. And this is the non-salvation hope, and this is the general hope that we try to have around an area. Whenever I first came here, something that I realized Astoria needed, that South Fulton needed, was a sense of hope, an expectation that things can be better. Now, that is a vague definition that could be filled in later on. What does it mean that things could be better in Astoria? Well, economically, it could mean that businesses could happen or could flourish. Or that maybe, I know we have a hard time here in South Fulton getting seasoned, excellent teachers to come away from other schools to come here. We've had a frustration where we feel like we'll bring in a teacher for a couple years, that they get their experience and they leave. And so we have maybe the hope that we won't just be a stepping stone for new teachers or new people. But like the hope that things can get better is something that I've often thought about, where why is it that when I look around and I ask people about Astoria, Vermont, Ipava, Table Grove, Bader, Browning, that there's an apathetic, nonchalant attitude that we're just going to slowly wither away and die. Apathy, or the lack of passion, is the opposite of hope. And something that's really burdened me is watching how there's a lot of apathy in this community and around the country, where people just kind of set back and resolve to say, oh well. The last level of hope, though, before I dig more into that second level of hope, is this anticipation of God's completeness and God's promises to be true. And the reason why I separate the second and the third level of hope versus, obviously, the first level of vague, bad hope, is that the level of hope that something greater ultimately is going to happen with God's completing of His work is a hope that only Christians can have. But sadly, what I see is people who have no connection to God or a God almost seem to have more of the second level of hope than a lot of Christians that I know. Now, there's a lot that can be dug into that, and a lot that hopefully we do dig into, but I want us to think about, why don't we as Christians have hope for the now and hope for the eternal? When you look at the Old Testament, when you read the Psalms, there's always this anticipation that the psalmist has of things getting better. Not just the salvation sense of getting better, but a getting better. Things can and will get better. But let's talk about areas where people don't have hope. If we don't have a lot of hope here in South Fulton, and if you look at a lot of churches across America, they kind of have no hope of really being flourishing anymore. I wanted to understand, what is the mentality of something or someone or an area that there is no hope? And in doing so, I researched, why is it that you have women who are in prostitution, that whenever they're rescued out of prostitution or being in sex slavery, that 96 out of 100 return back into that life? I think that a lack of hope is tied to this statement: abuse that is known is better than a future that is unknown. Now, hopefully nobody here can identify with the 96 women that returned. But I want us to look at the fact that biblical hope says that God desires to set the captives free. You read the Old Testament prophets, the hope is that those who are enchained or enslaved or oppressed are going to be released. When you read the words of Jesus, he says, I am a doctor for the sick. I am one who comes to make you whole. I come to give you life abundantly. Hope bleeds into every area of our life. You could say that hope is actually a confession of an assurance of something greater. But this is where things get kind of weird and awkward, because as Christians, what is it that we are also promised? Think about this. Hopefully all of you have been reading the words of Jesus and reading through. We are promised trials. We are promised persecution. We are promised tribulations. And in this passage, Peter says, "In all of these you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials." See, I believe that a lot of the reason why we have apathy in America right now, why we have a lack of hope, why things are feeling so bad and down and gloomy, is because we don't have a proper view of hard times and difficulty. You have to embrace the difficult and the hard in order to get better. And it's actually ironic that in a discussion about how do we get things better at school, something that had been going through my mind all week was actually said. You actually have to admit how bad is in order to move forward. Again, as a coach, an athlete has to admit their complete needs and their reality of who they are if they're going to be better. If you try to coach someone to be a better quarterback and they never admit that their elbow isn't getting high enough, they're never going to throw the ball well enough. So part of the reason why I think we lack complete hope is because we don't want to actually admit how bad things are, or how bad, now this is going to be weird, how bad things feel. Hope is an emotion, right? Joy is an emotion. Love also is strongly an emotion tied with an action. In fact, emotions and actions go hand in hand. But to talk about emotions opens up a very mixed bag. How many of you enjoy talking about your feelings with people? How many of you like making fun of people that talk about how they feel? How many of you just think that the cheesy cornball Hallmark movies are just so funny because that's not reality? I enjoy the Hallmark movies, by the way. Ever since having kids, it's weird. I almost cried during one the other day. But then, obviously, there's dust in the air. I think one of my kids jumped on my chest, and something else No, but even with that, think about it. Why is that we as males often have to defend an emotion? Well, part of it, I think, comes from a misunderstanding of emotions. Neuroscientists have actually studied emotions intensely since they've been able to do imaging and different pads and things that they stick onto the brain, and they make you see pictures and what goes on. Do you know that emotions are actually just your brain's prediction of a future? Your brain sees a stimulus or feels or hears a stimulus, and it responds accordingly. So emotions are a biological response to seeing, tasting, smelling, touching, or hearing something. So your brain is just trying to predict what's going to happen. So if you are trained to never admit pain, or if you're training yourself, or I'll take this, let me move 2 steps back. I know a word that people don't like to hear is, that triggered someone. I know it's in the news where, trigger points, and a lot of people make fun of the safe spaces on colleges where safe words are used. But think about this. Why is it that if I have about 5 words or names that I could say right now, and I can know that half of you will grimace at me and will stop listening to me and might even say certain bad words about me at lunch? Those would be called triggers, because your brain has actually, because of what you've experienced, can predict an outcome about it. But what about this? What if I were to mention venison jerky? I triggered you in a good way. Hopefully, if any of you have a negative response to venison jerky, the Lord needs to have mercy on your soul. And you do not know life to the fullest as it was promised. So the reality is our brain responds to certain things. And something that has to be admitted, though, is that we can train ourselves to emotionally respond differently to things. If you believe that you deserve the best, what will happen when you don't get it? If you believe that you are entitled to a level of comfort, what happens when you are not comfortable? You see, emotions are very much tied to hope, because when we react and interact with the stimulus from a scientific point, the data of having pain, suffering, grief, life change, if we don't react to it from a biblical standpoint of I am able to get stronger and glorify God through this, then all that we have left is a feeling of frustration, disappointment, and anger. I was listening to an interview with an 800-meter runner. Her name's Charlene, and she's recorded the 7th fastest USA 800-meter time. Now, this time's not going to mean a lot to many of you, but she ran 800 meters, so half of a mile, in 1 minute and 57 seconds. I had a hard time listening to that because that's faster than I had ever run it. So I'm like, I don't like this. But one of the things she mentioned was that as a runner, you have to always anticipate to win, but if you expect to win every time you compete, then you're never going to be emotionally stable as an athlete. You always compete to win, but you realize, especially as a runner, that some days your body just isn't there. So she said that the best way to have hope of winning is to realize that sometimes you don't win. And as long as you give it your all, that's what you're in control of. It's what you can do. So, hope. Now we're getting back to the text, this idea of hope. The hope in the present, the hope in the here and the now. As Christians, how are we interacting with the people around us? Because oftentimes I see excuses for why things are bad. I am sick and tired of people blaming COVID-19 for fill in the blank bad stuff. You know what? COVID-19, again, if I take a poll of this room, there's going to be 30 opinions about it. That's not the reason why people are failing classes. That's not the reason why marriages are getting divorced. That's not the reason why a church would die, and that's not a reason why someone would commit suicide. It's the reason that there's a lack of hope inside of that situation that is not being addressed. Problems, trials, tribulations, they reveal more of what's going on. When the going gets tough, the tough get going, is a statement that's been made. But also, hard times reveal someone's character. I believe a lot of us have wanted to just brush over issues in our lives and the lives of our friends and the lives of our family and the life of our community. And I honestly believe that it's taken a pandemic for us to realize that we need to do better in a lot of areas. But why is it that we can do better, and why is it that the eternal hope that we have actually calls us to have hope in the present? Well, one, I mentioned that it's because we can view the current trials and tribulations as a means of having growth and glorying and honoring Jesus Christ. Read the stories about people who are persecuted and imprisoned for their faith. Peter Yasik, who was imprisoned in Sudan with the Voice of the Martyrs. I'm reading his autobiography. I'm almost all the way done through it. Richard Wurmbrand, read his biography. Listen to the podcast every Saturday. I was listening to a podcast about this man in Iran who was imprisoned for simply, they wanted to find a reason to imprison a pastor, and they said, you're guilty of espionage because you're going to all the foreign embassies. And he was actually just getting visas to go to conferences. But what do they say? They say that it's in that moment of persecution that if they realize that the words of Jesus, if he said them and they're true, that they're able to glorify him. It was stated by Peter Yasik, I believe it was, that Christianity is like the only major world religion that teaches you to love your enemy and turn the cheek whenever you're assaulted. Think about that. Christianity's confrontation of the trial of being hurt is to say God is greater. And whenever you can say God is greater in a moment, then you can live in a frustrating situation in the present. But this is also where I believe 13 through 16 has to be reiterated and repeated and reminded over and over. Therefore, in light of the hope of the gospel, in light of the hope that your sins can be forgiven, that there will be a time when Jesus makes all things new and we're able to see him face to face. We're able to be in a perfect new heavens and new earth. In light of that, therefore, with minds that are alert and fully sober, set your hope on the grace to be brought to you when Jesus Christ is revealed as his coming. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy, because I am holy. Now this is going to be a hard pill to swallow. But do you know why I think a lot of us lack hope? Because we are conforming our ways to the world and not being holy. How can you have the feeling and the presence of an eternal hope if you're saying, I'm going to be as the world? And this is where I watch and I look and I think about, why is it that Christians are unable to reach into the communities that are hurting the most? Have you ever asked yourself that question? Like, ask yourself, make a list in your mind right now. What are the 3 groups of people that need Jesus? You're just like, wow, like they are broken, they are lost, they're confused, they're hurting. Why is it that that group of people isn't looking at a church and saying, wow, Jesus transforms people. I want that transformation. I want that love. I want that hope. When an unsaved person sees a Christian, they should say, I want that hope. But do you know what they usually say? I don't want to be miserable like that person. If you say, I'm being holy, doggone it, and I hate it, you're not being holy. You're being angry. And you're sinning in light of it. There are things that are hard to do that we do just because we're supposed to do because of our position in life. As a parent, we have to sacrifice certain things, certain comforts, certain joys, so to say, because it's better for the life of our child. But as Christians, think about this. If we don't look any different than the world, then why would the world think that we have a hope to offer them? I know sometimes it's popular to bash on celebrity pastors, but if you look at the last 2 years, very well-known pastors from some churches that we would say are good, theologically sound churches that are growing have had their careers ended in adultery, have had their careers ended with anger, outbursts, plagiarism, you name it. Some of you remember some televangelists having been caught in the very vices that they preached against the day before. When the world sees Christians not being holy, not having hope, but just trying to look as much like the world but kind of be Christian, they go, why do I even need this Jesus in the first place? So you're telling me I can be a Christian and live my life to the fullest, but, have to sacrifice one or two things? Who wants to do that? But if you realize that as a Christian, you live your fullest life in light of sacrifice and being holy and recognizing that Jesus is greater. And that starts to bring it about. It's funny. I do honestly believe it goes back to the statement of you have to admit how bad things are in order to get better from them. So in high school, my brothers and I and all the cross-country nerds and geeks that we were played this board game called Star Wars Epic Duels, where you made the Star Wars franchise into a card game where there was attack cards and defense cards, and we bought it. My oldest brother, who went off to college, he brought back a version of it, and that's how we got locked into it. And we found out that we bought it at just the right time, because if you were to buy it right now on Amazon, it'd be like $135. So we were cool before it was cool, which means we weren't cool. You got to admit how bad things are in order to get better. But Han Solo and Chewbacca so you had these two characters that were together for a deck, and they were my favorite group, because who doesn't want to have Chewbacca be their character? And he had this card called the Bowcaster, and it was the biggest attack card in the entire game. And you'd have to discard cards after using them, and Han Solo had a card called Never Tell Me the Odds, which would be you take your discard pile and shuffle it back into your deck, and you'd have a higher chance of being able to use this Bowcaster attack again. I was able to somehow, by pure chance, use the Bowcaster 6 times in one game. And I will always live on that high point. But that's not a point that I want to give. I just want to I did one thing good in my life, and I won one game of Star Wars Epic Duels. But the statement, never tell me the odds, sometimes that removes hope from us. Because, well, think about this. What are the odds that my daughters would have their genetic makeup to be who they are? Well, if you read your biology classes, it's like 1 in billions, millions, depending on who you are, like in your health, that the exact sperm and egg would meet to be my 3 daughters. If I didn't realize that it was so improbable that that exact person would happen, then I wouldn't realize the miracle. Or if I realized that there's only one woman in the entire world who'd want to marry me, I wouldn't celebrate that she did. That's true. I felt that there'd be no woman that would ever want to marry me. And she's probably questioning that after hearing about Star Wars Epic Duels. But when you actually realize how difficult something is, then you can celebrate whenever it's overcome. So one of the things that I've heard a lot from teachers is that they don't want to be told, hey, you can get through it. Hey, it'll get better. Oh, we're all in this together. They want to hear, yeah, this stinks. Oh, wow, that's what you have to deal with? And then maybe say, but you can get through it. A lot of teachers I've seen just post rants of stop trying to be positive and not let me actually admit that this is hard. Or one illustration that I want to bring is, so when you think about what a police officer does, you probably don't think about how oftentimes they have to be the person who's there on the scene of a death to tell their family member, your husband died, your daughter died. And there's this police officer that I was listening to him talk about empathy. And he said he learned one time that sometimes if you want to be there for someone the most, you got to shut your mouth. Don't try to give them a hug. Be there and let them control the terms. He talks about how there's this woman whose husband died, and he tried to touch her on the shoulder to make her feel better, and she just revolted from that. She did not want to be touched. Her husband had just died. And then the neighbor came into the room and tried to do the same, and she just couldn't take anyone touching her. Don't touch me. My husband just died. People wanting to help her tried to offer a hope before they felt the hurt that she was feeling. This police officer learned from that time, and another instance where he was with someone whose husband, I believe, had just committed suicide. He said that this woman just kept on saying, "How am I supposed to tell my kids? How am I supposed to tell my kids? How am I supposed to tell my kids? How am I supposed to tell my kids?" This guy's a police officer. He's been trained to say these are the things that you tell someone whenever. But he's like, in that moment, I realized I had to just sit down in a seat across the room from her, eye level, and sit there until she was ready to actually hear me say something. You have to actually admit the depth of hurt and pain to move forward. So the ironic part about hope is that hope doesn't gloss over the gritty. Hope admits when things are bad, and then in light of that, they say, maybe it's not as bad. But you have to admit the depth of the difficulty. Peter doesn't say, oh, those trials and tribulations, they're not really hard. You know, the irony is, so James says the same things about how we're supposed to count it all joy when we face various trials and persecutions. You know, me having just graduated from college at Moody, I worked through a class on the book of James at the church that I was at for 1 year between then and seminary. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to study this word to see if trials means something specific. Do you know what it means? Anything that's not easy. So if you have a cold, all the way to if you just had a tragic car accident in your family, this word can cover it. And this isn't to say that those are the same level, but this is to say that anything you deal with should be counted pure joy because of Jesus Christ. And it's admitting that difficulty that you can work your way through. So as Christians, I want to challenge us. Are we placing our eternal final hope upon what Jesus has done, and in light of that, living out hope in the present? Because hope in the present means that we can admit that things are bad. And once you actually sit inside of that thought, that biological response that an emotion is, you can then work forward. So a way that we can experience hope is to not gloss over anger or sadness or depression. Because when you're angry or mad or sad or depressed in that moment, say, why do I think this? Why do I feel this? I mean, this is kind of parenting 101 with small children. Your child's freaking out, and you don't just grab them and throw your hand over their mouth until they, stop moving. You let them feel and vent and give emotions, and then you can say, oh, do I just need to kiss your toe? And as a teenager, it's all the myriad of things that are raising teenagers, and I won't act like that's not going to be the most difficult challenge of your life. But from what I've heard, you can get through parenting teenagers, which I'm going to have 3 teenage girls at one point in my house. And that's just been the only thought that's reverberated through my head. But I'll be able to make it through because of the hope of the gospel. And because of the hope of the gospel, I'll realize that I actually have the opportunity in that moment to disciple 3 young women into being women who bring the hope of Jesus wherever they go. If you don't have hope in the present, if you just kind of feel like you're skating through on this apathetic treadmill of trying to just make it through each day, I want to encourage you that one of maybe the best things you could do is admit that you feel angry, tired, frustrated, or even depressed. Because then you can start to work your way forward. Talk to someone that you love. Remind yourself of the gospel. And then move forward. Let's pray.